Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video, we will be talking about the spinal and cranial meninges. In this video, we will talk about the three types of spinal and cranial meninges. We will talk about the difference between cranial and spinal dura mater, and we will address where there are dural infoldings or partitions, and look at where they're located. The meninges are a group of layered membranes that envelop the brain and spinal cord. The spinal meninges and cranial meninges are contiguous with each other, so they form one large wrapper for both parts of the central nervous system. We have three layers of meninges. The dura mater is the outermost, and it's the strongest of the three. Deep to that, we have the arachnoid mater, and then touching the surface of the brain and spinal cord is the pia mater. Together, they're going to provide support and protection for the central nervous system. Now, dura mater, as I said, is the outermost meninges. And I agree that meninges is a super awkward singular here, so if you want to say meninge, I'm not going to fuss at you. Dura translates roughly, or dura mater, I should say, or mater, if we want to get real strict with our Latin, translates to rough mother. And that is a well-earned title, as it's made up of really dense connective tissue. So you can see in the image here just how thick it is. So it provides a really hardy outer layer of protection. Now, as our learning objectives implied, there are some subtle differences between the cranial and spinal dura. They are still contiguous with one another, like all the meninges. But the dura that surrounds the brain has two distinct layers, where the spinal dura just has one. In the cranium, the dura has a superficial periosteal layer that lines the bones of the cranial cavity. All right, so if we're looking at the illustration here, here is our periosteal layer. It also has a deeper layer that lines the surface of the brain. This is called the meningeal layer. And that meningeal layer is going to follow the contours, I should say the major contours of the brain. So it dips down into the longitudinal fissure that separates the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. And it dips into the gap between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. All right, practically speaking, what this means is that we have areas here where the contours of the brain do not match the contours of the cranial bones, and that leaves a gap in the meningeal layers here for the dura mater. Okay? These create folds of meningeal dura that kind of press together down here. All right? So we have a single layer here, but as you come further down, it presses up against that other meningeal layer. Okay, these are called dural infoldings, and these are typically also associated with dural venous sinuses, where you still have a gap here remaining between the periosteal and meningeal layers. There are several of these dural infoldings surrounding the brain. The two largest are the falx cerebri, that sits in the mid-sagittal plane between the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and then the tentorium cerebelli that sits between the occipital lobe of the cerebrum and the cerebellum. All right, so note here that these each span a decent distance in toward the center of the brain here, right? And I want you to think about how that will limit the movement of the brain within the skull. So these don't just function to keep parts of the brain separate. They're there to prevent movements and anchor the brain down securely. There are a few smaller partitions as well. There is a falx cerebelli to go along with the falx cerebri. But keep in mind that the lobes of the cerebellum aren't separated by a full fissure like the cerebrum is. So this is a much shallower falx. Then we have the diaphragm ocelli, which covers the pituitary gland of the hypophysis as it sits in the hypophyseal fossa. So you can see here the pituitary gland's little infundibulum or stalk sticking up, and that would connect up to the hypothalamus. And then all around that, we can see the diaphragm ocelli, this white dura mater that surrounds everything and holds that pituitary gland in place. We're going to move deep next to the arachnoid mater, or the spidery mother. All right, this middle meninx looks completely different to the dura. Where the dura is thick and opaque, the arachnoid is very thin and filmy. I always think it looks kind of like plastic cling wrap. It kind of acts that way in the lab too. This has a number of little connections down to the pia mater called little struts. We call them arachnoid trabeculae. Trabeculae means strut. These are there to help maintain the spatial relationship between these two meninges because the space between them is going to be filled with fluid. So the subarachnoid space is the proper name for the space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. It's a place where a lot of vasculature travels, but most importantly, it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions and nourishes the spinal cord and brain. Directly relating to CSF circulation, the arachnoid mater has a number of specialized protrusions up into the dural venous sinuses that allow cerebrospinal fluid to drain from the subarachnoid space and back into the blood supply. These protrusions are called arachnoid granulations, and what they are very tightly folded little tufts of arachnoid matter that press up and through into the dural sinuses. All right, so now lest you think that these are like small and flimsy like the rest of the arachnoid mater, I want to point your attention over here to the photos on the right. And here you can see that these granulations are not only easily visible, but they're really big. Okay, and they're so big and they exert so much pressure on the sinuses and the cranial bones surrounding them that you can actually see little indentations left behind on the surrounding bones here. These are called granular foveae. Okay, so all those little pits you see there are good examples of a granular. I'm actually not sure what the singular of fovea is. I'll have to figure that one out. All right, we are finally down into the pia mater, or the delicate mother. It is the innermost meninx, and it adheres very tightly to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. It adheres so tightly, in fact, that we can't dissect it away. We simply know that it is there from looking at histological preparations. All right, the nice thing about being so closely adhered to the surface of the central nervous system is that the pia can follow all of the really tiny contours of the brain and spinal cord to provide support. So all of the little furrows on the spinal cord, all of the sulci of the brain, these are all covered with pia that follows the contours in there. You can think of it a little bit like a skin for the central nervous system. All right, and that brings us through all of the meninges. Your review question is, the falx cerebri forms from which meninx? There's a lot of dura mater here for the answer options, but the correct answer is the meningeal layer of the dura mater. So remember, the meningeal layer follows the contours of the brain, and that is what's going to pull away and run deep into the longitudinal fissure and into the fissure between the cerebrum and cerebellum. All right, that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for joining me.